Welcome to the silent verdict.
With Clara Monroe and Elias Gray.
Imagine this. You're arrested for something. Charges that eventually just disappear. But because of how you were handled, you end up paralyzed.
It's a truly harrowing scenario, and unfortunately, it's the reality for Richard Randy Cox.
This happened back on June 19th, 2022, in New Haven, Connecticut.
Yeah, there was a weapons complaint during a Juneteenth block party, and Mr. Cox, who was 36 at the time, was identified as a suspect and arrested.
And the initial charges?
They were possession of a firearm, breach of peace, and carrying a pistol without a permit.
Okay, but crucially,
all those charges were later dropped. Didn't stick.
So after the arrest, he's handcuffed, put in a cruiser, then moved to a police transport wagon.
Yeah.
Officer Oscar Diaz is driving.
Right. And here's a critical detail. That transport wagon, it had absolutely no seat belts, no safety restraints for prisoners in the back.
Wow. Just none.
None. At the time, the New Haven Police Department policy, well, it just didn't require them in those wagons.
What did it require then?
It focused on handcuffing hands behind the back, palms out, searching the person, putting them in the van, and making sure the doors were locked. That was it.
That lack of restraint, especially for someone who hasn't even been convicted, it feels like a major legal issue brewing.
It really does. It brings up the 14th Amendment, the Due Process Clause.
Explain that a bit. How does the 14th Amendment apply here before any conviction?
Well, the core idea is that when the state takes away someone's liberty, even temporarily, like during an arrest, it takes on a responsibility for their basic safety and well-being.
So they have a duty to protect.
Exactly. A duty to provide reasonable safety, necessary medical care. It's not the same standard as the 8th Amendment's cruel and unusual punishment for convicted prisoners, but there's definitely a responsibility. This case, sadly, highlights a failure of that duty.
Okay, so Cox is in the back, handcuffed, no seatbelt. Then comes the moment that changes everything.
Yes. Officer Diaz is driving Mr. Cox to the detention center, and he's speeding.
How fast?
He's doing 36 miles per hour in a 25 zone, so 11 miles over the limit.
And then
Something happens, we don't know exactly what, maybe another car, but he has to slam on the brakes. Hard.
Oh no, in that van.
Yeah.
Handcuffed, no restraints. What happened to Richard Cox?
The sudden stuff, well, it threw him violently forward.
Just flung him.
Headfirst, right into the front wall of the transport wagon's compartment. Remember, he's handcuffed behind his back, completely unable to brace himself.
Terrible. And his reaction?
Almost immediately, Mr. Cox started saying he couldn't move. He was injured.
And Officer Diaz, what did he do?
Well, initially, Officer Diaz seemed skeptical. He could see Mr. Cox on the camera inside the van.
Yeah?
He told him to basically get up, sit up.
Told him to get up. When the man's saying he can't move after hitting his head.
Yes, but what's maybe even more concerning is what happened next.
Go on.
Despite Mr. Cox clearly being in distress, saying he couldn't move, Officer Diaz didn't stop to check on him or call for an ambulance right there.
He kept driving.
He kept driving, continued on to the detention center.
But surely there's a policy about injured prisoners.
There is, or there was. New Haven Police Department policy at the time stated that if an officer knows a prisoner might be in distress, they need to notify the dispatcher immediately and render aid if it's safe.
So continuing to drive seems like a direct violation of that policy.
It certainly appears that way. Delaying medical attention in that situation, it raises serious questions.
Okay, so they get to the detention center. What happens when they arrive?
Several other officers are there. Sergeant Segui, Officer Presley, Officer Lavandier, and Officer Rivera. An ambulance had been called by this point, but it hadn't arrived yet.
So they waited for the ambulance, right? Given the potential injury?
No, they didn't wait.
What? What did they do?
They decided to move Mr. Cox themselves. They dragged him out of the transport wagon.
Dragged him out of the van after he said he couldn't move and possibly injured his neck or spine?
Yes. And then they placed him in a wheelchair.
In a wheelchair. With no support for his neck or anything?
Exactly. No neck support, no limb support. Just put him in the chair.
But everyone knows, right?
Yeah.
If you suspect a spinal injury, you don't move the person. You immobilize them. That's basic first aid.
It's universally accepted medical protocol. Keep the person still, immobilize the spine. What the officers did was the exact opposite and incredibly dangerous.
It just beggars belief. What are the legal implications of acting like that? Ignoring his pleas, dragging him?
Legally, this looks like a textbook case of deliberate indifference to a serious medical need. Under the 14th Amendment, that's a constitutional violation.
Because they knew he was hurt.
They knew he claimed injury, they knew he couldn't move, and they chose actions that could, and likely did, make things much worse. That's the indifference part.
And beyond the Constitution, what about, state laws? Criminal charges?
Potentially, yes. In Connecticut, their actions could fall under reckless endangerment in the second degree.
How so?
That law applies when someone recklessly does something that creates a substantial risk of physical injury, and they consciously disregard that risk. Dragging someone who might have a spinal injury, well, that seems to fit.
Okay. Any other potential state charges?
There's also Connecticut's statute on cruelty to persons.
Cruelty?
Yes. It covers intentionally depriving someone of necessary physical care, which can be a felony, or if it's done through criminal negligence, it's a misdemeanor.
And his complaints about not being able to move, their dismissive reaction, that could point towards negligence at least.
A strong argument could certainly be made for criminal negligence, if not intentional deprivation. They were told about the problem and didn't provide proper care.
It's just awful thinking about what he must have gone through all that time.
Yeah.
How long did it take for him to get proper medical help?
It was nearly an hour, almost a full hour from the moment of impact in the van until he finally arrived at Yale New Haven Hospital.
An hour. And the diagnosis?
It was devastating. A cervical spine fracture, permanent paralysis below the neck.
Permanent paralysis because he was thrown in a van with no seatbelt and then mishandled. Unbelievable.
So obviously he took legal action.
He did. On September 27th, 2022, Mr. Cox filed a lawsuit. A big one.
How big? $100 million. Against the 5 officers involved Diaz, Segui, Presley, Lavandier, Rivera, and the city of New Haven itself, alleging civil rights violations, negligence.
Did it go to trial?
No, they reached a settlement on June 9th, 2023.
For how much?
The city settled for $45 million.
$45 million. That must be some kind of record, right?
It is. It's reported as the largest police misconduct settlement in U.S. history.
Wow. That number alone speaks volumes about the city's perceived liability here.
Absolutely. A settlement that large signals a recognition of profound wrongdoing.
Okay, so a massive settlement for Mr. Cox. What about accountability for the officers themselves? Were they fired, disciplined?
Initially, yes. Action was taken against all 5. Officer Presley actually retired before the disciplinary process finished.
And the other 4? Diaz, Segui, Lavandier, Rivera.
They were all fired by the New Haven Board of Police Commissioners, terminated.
Okay, so they lost their jobs.
Well, it gets a bit more complicated, especially for Officer Diaz, the driver.
How so? What happened?
He appealed his termination, and this is pretty controversial. In January 2024, the Connecticut State Board of Mediation and Arbitration overturned the firing.
Overturned it.
So he wasn't fired. His termination was reduced to just a 15-day unpaid suspension.
15 days. For his role in an incident that led to permanent paralysis and a $45 million settlement.
That's correct. And he was reinstated to the police force in January 2025.
Was that challenged? Does the city fight it?
The city did try to challenge the arbitration board's ruling in court, but they were unsuccessful. So Officer Diaz is back on duty.
That is quite something. It definitely raises questions about accountability mechanisms, doesn't it?
It certainly does. It highlights the complexities and sometimes surprising outcomes of police disciplinary processes and arbitration.
What about those potential criminal charges we talk about? Reckless endangerment, cruelty.
Yes, those charges were filed. Back in November 2022, all 5 officers were charged with reckless endangerment and misdemeanor cruelty to persons.
And what's the status of those charges now?
They all pleaded not guilty. They applied for something called accelerated rehabilitation. It's a program in Connecticut where if you complete it successfully, the charges can eventually be dismissed.
Did they get into that program?
No. Their applications were denied by a judge.
So the criminal charges are still active?
That's right. As of now, the criminal charges against all 5 officers are still pending. The cases haven't been resolved yet.
Okay. This whole horrible incident, did it at least lead to some changes? Policies, laws.
Yes. Thankfully, it did spark significant changes, both locally and at the state level.
What did the New Haven Police Department do?
Almost immediately after Mr. Cox's injury, they issued Special Order 2203. It completely revised their transportation policy.
How so? What's different now?
Well, number 1, it mandates seatbelts in all vehicles used for transporting prisoners.
Finally.
About time.
What else?
It also prohibits officers from speeding or using cell phones while transporting prisoners. And critically, it requires officers to ask about injuries before and after transport, and mandates calling for emergency medical services immediately if a prisoner is injured, complains of injury, or even just appears to need medical attention.
So basically addressing almost every failure point in Mr. Cox's transport.
Precisely. It seems like a direct response to the specific events of that day.
And you mentioned state-level changes, too.
Yes, the Connecticut state legislature passed two relevant bills in June 2023.
What did they do?
One, House Bill 6873 requires the state's police training council to create a model policy on seatbelt use for prisoners during transport, including discipline for violations, so standardizing it across the state.
Okay, good. And the second bill?
Senate Bill 1062. This one mandates that police officers must call for emergency medical services if someone in their custody or someone they're dealing with has a serious medical condition or seems medically unstable.
Taking away the discretion, essentially. If someone needs help, call for it.
Exactly. It aims to prevent delays like the one Mr. Cox experienced. These are systemic responses trying to prevent a recurrence.
Looking back at everything, the initial incident, the handling at the station, the legal outcomes, the policy changes, how do you sum up the officer's conduct here?
Honestly, it demonstrates a really profound level of negligence, a shocking disregard for Mr. Cox's basic safety and human dignity.
It wasn't just a mistake, was it?
No, it went far beyond a simple procedural error. Their actions likely involved criminal conduct, definitely violated department policy, and infringed on his constitutional rights. There was a disturbing lack of empathy, a failure of their fundamental duty of care.
And all this happened to a man who, let's remember,
was completely compliant. Richard Cox didn't resist arrest. He didn't pose a threat. His life was changed forever purely because of the actions and inactions of these officers and the systemic failures that allowed it to happen.
his lawsuit, that massive settlement, it was his way of seeking some measure of justice for that harm.
Absolutely. A necessary step in demanding accountability.
Richard Cox's story is just, it's such a stark, chilling reminder, isn't it, about the incredible responsibility police have for people in their custody and what happens when that responsibility is just completely abandoned.
It really is. And it leaves you wondering. We see the policy changes, the new laws, this record-breaking settlement, but does that equal true accountability?
Or are there deeper systemic problems still lurking? Problems that mean something like this, maybe not exactly the same, but another tragedy born from indifference, could still happen.
That's the unsettling question, isn't it?
It really makes you think. For you listening, consider that balance. The authority we give law enforcement versus the fundamental rights and safety of every single person they interact with, especially someone in custody. Beyond the new rules and the money, what else do you think needs to happen to truly ensure safety and dignity for everyone in police custody? Something to ponder.